My guest today on episode 72 of the Ikigai Podcast is Andrew Soren. Andrew Soren is the founder and CEO of Eudaimonia by Design, a global network of facilitators, coaches, advisors who share a passion for well-being and believe organizations must be designed to enable it. For the past 25 years, Andrew has worked with some of the most recognized brands, nonprofits, and public sector teams to co-create values-based cultures, develop positive leadership, and design systems that empower people to be their best. Andrew is a board member of the International Positive Psychology Association and chaired the 8th World Congress on Positive Psychology this year in 2023. And Andrew, you are also an ICF certified coach. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicholas. It's a pleasure to be here on a podcast that celebrates an equally untranslatable concept related to our well-being. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always awesome to connect with people all over the world who shares a passion for meaning in life and work. So we're talking specifically about work, I guess, today. And so, as you know, I was on LinkedIn and I saw that you had shared a post announcing the publication of a paper titled Meaningful Work, Wellbeing and Health, Enacting a Eudaimonic Vision. And I thought, I'm going to read that. So, yeah, this is a paper you co-authored with Carol Riff. Do you want to touch on Carol's impact on positive psychology and her contribution to the paper?
Absolutely. Yes, Carol Riff is an extraordinary psychologist. Absolutely my hero in so many ways, in terms of her research on the idea of eudaimonia, which is an idea that I'm sure that we will get into in a little bit. But her contribution to the field really, in the 80s, in the mid 80s, when she was doing her graduate work, she was looking back over the history of the 20th century and a lot of the psychological contributions of humanists and existential psychologists who were doing a lot of work trying to understand what well-being might mean in different kinds of contexts. This is well before anybody was talking about positive psychology or that movement really started to emerge kind of in the 21st century. So she was predating a lot of that and came up with a model called psychological well-being, which she published in 1989, I believe. And that model has 6 kind of categorical dimensions that she really built up from the literature of all of these extraordinary humanists and existentialists, folks like Maslow and Viktor Frankl and Fromm and so many others who were asking these questions about what well-being might mean, what psychological functioning might look like, and not just what psychological illness might be. So that's a little bit about Carol, and since then she's done amazing work, predominantly at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and runs their Institute on Aging, and specifically this study that we'll probably talk a little bit about as well, called Midas. And she invited me to co-edit a whole entire special issue of the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, all about meaning in life, meaning and purpose in life and its relationship to our psychological and physical health. And as part of that special issue, we wrote this specific article about meaningful work and its impact on our health and well-being. And yeah, that's a little bit about Carol.
There you go. Yeah, when I stumbled upon her, I was kind of pleasantly surprised and thought, wow, she predates this, I guess what we call the positive literature boom of the early 2000s or the late 1990s. And as I mentioned to you, she doesn't seem to get as much recognition as some of the more popular names we hear, like Martin Seligman or Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. So I'm glad we get to talk about her just briefly on this episode.
She's the real deal. For anybody interested in the science of well-being, she's an extraordinary figure.
Awesome. Well, let's start with the title. And I do forget that a lot of people might not have heard the word eudaimonia before. So, how would you define meaningful work, and what is eudaimonic vision?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with meaningful work because it's easy relative to eudaimonia, which is hard. Meaningful work in the literature. There's first of all, there's lots of definitions of what meaningful work is. If you actually peel back the academic literature and look at it, there's one study that looks at just the definitions alone. And I think it was published in 2018. And at that point, there were 36 different definitions of what meaningful work could be. So there isn't necessarily consensus on this one, but most people tend to default to a definition that Pratt and Ashworth came up with in 2003 that says that meaningful work is simply work that is personally significant and worthwhile. Work that is personally significant and worthwhile. And meaningful work tends to show up in various ways in the work that we do. So it can be in the tasks that we do, in the roles that we play in our organizations, in our interactions with other colleagues or with managers or with customers or with the community, and as part of organizations in and of themselves. Meaningful work shows up in all of those different places. Now, you might ask, where does meaningful work come from? And that requires the much more complex answer that at least Carol and I start way back about 2,400 years ago with Aristotle. And so kind of I'll try not to completely derail this whole entire podcast, but basically, if you asked Aristotle, what's the meaning of life? He would probably have waxed poetically and taken you for a long walk, and would say, well, no one agrees on what the meaning of life is, but as far as I'm concerned, it's virtuous action moderated by reason, or what he would shorthand that as eudaimonia. And eudaimonia, let's just break that down. In ancient Greek, eu is good, and daimon is spirit or demon or God.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about eudaimonia as this good spirit that lives within each of us, that has the potential to be manifest in some way, to do something worthy of you. And you is going to be different for every single one of us. What you're here and capable of doing in this world is going to be different from me and from every person that you encounter. But in some ways, the work of life is to try to figure out what that purpose is that you are here to be manifesting and potentiating in this world, and to try to figure out, how do you bring the best of yourself to do it? And that's probably going to be really hard work. It's definitely not going to be easy work. You're probably going to fail a lot of the time. It's going to require an understanding of virtue, which in and of itself is an incredibly complicated thing. In fact, Aristotle was writing mostly about eudaimonia in the context of ethics and trying to understand what's the ethical life. And so you're going to constantly be having to figure out, how do I balance, every strength has its weaknesses. So how do I figure out how to kind of go within my own swim lane towards my purpose, and moderate my virtue and do stuff so that I can try to ultimately reach my full potential. Aristotle would say a life of doing that would be a life well lived, and you'd probably only understand it if you kind of look backwards at the end of it. And again, it might not feel very good. So there'd be lots of other people around that period of time who'd be like, "No, Aristotle, you're wrong. Like, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's the answer to a good life." And he was like, "No." So in many ways, meaningful work has its origins, at least in the Western tradition, in some of that kind of thinking.
Mm.
a virtuous action moderated by reason. And of course, many people have taken that and translated it into all sorts of different ways. If you asked Thomas Aquinas, he would have said that it's like a classical calling. He would have taken that eudaimonic ideal and said, let's like apply that duty and orientation to the church. And it's not the good demon inside of you. It's suppress that good demon and focus on God. And that certainly, but very much that grows out of this eudaimonic orientation, that a classical calling to the church is part of it. And then of course you have the Protestant Revolution and folks like Martin Luther who are like, no, it's not just about God. It's like it's secular work can be a divine calling too. And so that very much takes us into kind of throughout the Industrial Revolution and Protestant work ethic and into the 20th century. And then you have a whole bunch of existentialists like Viktor Frankl who might say that we actually have a psychological need for meaning and purpose that's really core to who we are as human beings. And then a whole bunch of organizational psychologists taking that and kind of, championing it and saying, hey, work should be significant and worthwhile, all the way up to, the Simon Sinek's of our day who have to say, start with why. If you're not doing meaningful work, you're doing something wrong, which is maybe an unfair characteristic of Simon Sinek. But nonetheless, I think that, all of that kind of takes us to where we get to today, and where I started with is that, people say eudaimonic work is work that is personally significant and worthwhile. And I think what we try to do in this article is say that actually is missing a whole lot of so many other things that Aristotle was trying to get at, that are much more virtuous, that are much more ethical, that are much more about the broader world, and not just about the I feeling that my work is significant and worthwhile.
Thank you for that. I think you previewed just much of your paper then, so people got an idea what it's about.
We can skip the rest. Let's talk about Ikigai.
Talk about the paper, but yeah, my journey of Ikigai led me to Eudaimonia, and it's again quite broad and hard to define in one sentence, let's say. But I guess what came up for me was, it seems very relatable to existential positive psychology, where we grow, and if we overcome challenges that are meaningful, or if we do work or engage in activities that are worthwhile yet maybe challenging, we seem to grow and learn more about ourselves and become this fuller person, and have a deeper understanding that we're capable of more, or we uncover this part of ourselves that we didn't realize existed. So it sort of makes a case for us to get out there and challenge ourselves. And I think it's a nice alternative to what we often hear in the modern literature or from a lot of coaches, this idea of, be the best version of yourself, which I'm quite sick of hearing. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that phrase? And would you associate that to eudaimonia, or do you think it's a sort of a corrupt interpretation?
I think it's absolutely a component of eudaimonia. Aristotle would have he sometimes used this metaphor of, or at least once he wrote about this metaphor of like the acorn and the oak tree, and the premise that if you find an acorn in the woods, and at least here in Canada, it is the fall and there are lots of acorns in the woods. Every single one of those acorns contains the possibility of a mighty oak tree, or any other kind of tree that acorn might be, but let's say it's an oak tree. But that it's not like every acorn just automatically turns into that oak tree. There's actually a ton of stuff that needs to happen to be able to potentiate ourselves. And there's the obvious things like, there needs to be water, and there needs to be air, and there needs to be oxygen, and there needs to be those environmental conditions. But But that acorn also has to be protected, and like other things can't eat that acorn before it's ready. It needs to be buried in the right place, and there has to be like all these like environmental conditions and ecological conditions and systemic conditions, let alone whatever the DNA of that actual acorn is, that are going to govern whether or not that acorn makes it into a mighty oak tree.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the challenge of this work, if you're actually going to get into it, is that it's really complex to try to figure out how we go about potentiating ourselves. And there aren't simple answers. There's no silver bullet to what that looks like. And anybody who's preaching that to you, quite frankly, is gaslighting you into believing that it's just up to you. And I think that, especially in the world of positive psychology, there can be this what one person calls cruel optimism, which is to a certain extent the American dream, which is like if you just work hard enough, everything can potentially be yours. If that's not happening for you, it's your fault because you're not working hard enough. And I think that certainly the literature that we're going to talk about in Meaningful Work, as just one micro example, would suggest that it's always going to be there's absolutely personal resources at stake that you need to bring to bear, and there's always going to be enabling conditions, and those two things have to play together, and we have to think about those things in systemic ways, and that's just complex. It's hard, and it's good work.
Well, there you go. Yeah, it's it's complicated, but it's worthwhile pursuing. I think a meaningful life, a challenging life, and I guess we just got to be careful it's not too self-centric, because that's sometimes the impression I get from some of the literature, the modern literature, and I always go back to the Japanese word for self, which is jibun, and it has you and part, or self and part, sort of indicating that you are a part of something bigger. And rather than thinking you're independent, you're actually very much interdependent. And you wouldn't be who you are without the influence of others. And you wouldn't be able to do what you want to do without the help of others. And I don't know if we hear enough of that in the current modern literature. But we'll move on to your paper. So, because, yeah, your paper examines the scientific findings of the MIDAS. So that's midlife in the US. So that must be a study. So that's a national longitudinal study. And yeah, that's obviously linked to work and well-being and health. So did you want to touch on that study and some of its findings?
Sure. I'll touch on it and literally only touch on it because in reality, this is Carol Riff's work. Okay. I mean, she's been the principal investigator of this study for close to 30 years, which in and of itself is a remarkable thing. So MIDAS, the midlife in the US, and there's actually a comparable study in Japan that has been created, the name of which I cannot remember in this particular moment. Is this incredible study that's based on a national representative sample of individuals within the U.S., which is important because it means that there's sociodemographic variability that's actually built into the research, which much of the research in the realm of psychology just doesn't actually have. And this is research that's done on well-being and health, and work is one component that is studied. It's longitudinal in nature. That means that this has been happening across decades, this particular study, which is really cool because it means that you can actually track cohorts of people and look at their changes in health and try to understand what are antecedents and consequences, what truly do genuinely lead to certain outcomes, and what are those outcomes all the way to death. And there's just an unprecedented richness in what this study has been able to do, because they have been able to get the participants who are going through the study to take an amazing wide-ranging list of assessments that look not only at their health, but also their kind of psychological outcomes, their biomarkers, a whole bunch of things. And one part of that is looking at the work-family interface, basically the relationship that people have between work and family, and the implications that that all has on people's health and well-being. And so that's the piece that we chose to look at, looking at kind of some of the latest literature coming out of that MIDA study, and it's open access. So there's literally thousands of papers that are published based on that data set all the time, and more every year. And if you look at the ones that look at work in the MIDA study, there's some findings, and they're not so great. They don't make work look so good, but they basically show that poor working conditions tend to predict ill health and eventually mortality. That there's a lot of racial disparities around job characteristics, and that links to a lot of inequities in well-being and health, and that in fact, well-being is kind of a bit predictive of your likelihood to be employed in the future, that our needs around work tend to change over a lifespan. Many of these things aren't surprising, but in some ways, these are some of the first times that you can actually see that longitudinally in studies, and look at specific aspects of work that offer deliberate pathways to things like meaning and purpose in life, and other aspects of psychological or eudaimonic well-being. So those are some of the major things that Midas looks at.
Right. It sounds like it's the gold standard for reference, with a lot of studies on work well-being and I guess life and work balance.
Totally.
So that's something handy to know for any researcher listening out there. So let's move on to a really interesting word, a word I think all of us want to experience, and this is freedom. And you mentioned in your paper that work must offer us freedom. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So this is a way of framing work that actually comes out of the United Nations, originally the Industrial Labour Organization, which kind of got subsumed by the UN over the last couple decades. But work is really important in our lives. The UN says that it's so crucial that it's like necessary to our dignity, well-being, and development as a human being. I mean, we spend more time, at least in most of us who are probably listening to this, most of us spend more time working than doing just about anything else than sleeping in our lives. And so again, the UN through the Industrial Labour Organization would say that means that work needs to be fundamentally decent. And they describe decent work as having four major attributes: equity, security, dignity, and freedom. So what's the freedom part? Well, the freedom part is really, you could think about it in two ways: freedom from and freedom to. So for work to be decent, work has to be free from things like physical or psychological harm or interference or domination, all the human rights aspects that you would expect the UN to be thinking about. But work also should offer us freedom to things like personal dignity, freedom to having autonomy in the choices that we make, freedom to choose ethics right over wrong, freedom to self-realize, all that kind of wonderful eudaimonic stuff that we were talking about, freedom to develop your best self, freedom to pursue what you think is valuable and purposeful in life. And so when we talk about work offering freedom, we're talking about both freedom from and freedom to.
It's an interesting word and concept, freedom, and to offer a perspective that might also tie into this by a research pioneer on the concept of Ikigai. Her name was Miko Kamiya, and she discovered there were the 7 Ikigai needs, and one was freedom. And she described freedom as, obviously you have freedom of choice, but with those choices, she said there's 2 sort of significant ones that people run away from. And one was basically delayed gratification, so that you put aside a immediate freedom for a better freedom in the future? Or perhaps more significantly, this one's really interesting, is you put aside your personal freedom for a freedom that serves a greater good. So I'm sure many people do that in their work. And she described it as you're freely choosing inconvenience to serve a greater good, but that's an expression of freedom in and of itself. So would you relate that to work? That some people do
Yeah.
put aside their personal freedom to do work that's meaningful, challenging, but they are sacrificing a part of their personal freedom at the same time?
Mm. It's a beautiful way of articulating it.
Mm.
I think that there's a lot of people, and we can talk a little bit about that in a bit in terms of, the challenges, the dark sides of meaningful work. But I think you've foreshadowed that really, really nicely, that people who choose to engage in deeply meaningful work are often making pretty extraordinary personal sacrifices. And I think that Midas literature maybe suggests some of that, although frankly, I'm not sure that Midas actually looks necessarily at the degree of meaning of the work. But it also just, it brings me back to this this notion of eudaimonic well-being versus hedonic well-being, which of course is the ancient, like those were the two kind of ancient Greek perspectives. And both of those words can translate into happiness. So it's interesting to think about like freedom versus happiness. But you could think about happiness as just as much good things with as few bad things as possible, which is really the hedonic way of thinking about like, we want comfort, we want pleasure, we want to just feel good. And that's what it is, which was just very different than this eudaimonic orientation, which is hard work. And you're like struggling with virtue and you're trying to figure out how to screw up a little less tomorrow than you did today. And that's just going to be a lifelong pursuit that's about the journey and not really any kind of destination. And in some ways it sucks. And in some ways it's hard. And to think that that's actually what, a perspective of happiness is, can, I think, hurt a lot of people's brains. And yet I think anybody who's actually tried to do that work knows that it has the potential to be immensely fulfilling and satisfying in a way that just, surrounding yourself with creature comforts doesn't.
Yeah, it's almost, I kind of relate it to this idea of you're trying to express yourself. And I used to say, so we're striving to be authentic. So we often talk about the authentic self, but that's a real struggle, like to be authentic all the time in everything you do, every person you meet. You can't always be 100% authentic, but I think that ties into eudaimonia. You want to be the person you want to be. You want to be honest. You want to be true to your values. And if something's hard and you're faced with a challenge, sometimes you think, oh, I just don't want to do this. But there's a part of you saying, well, you should do this. You should pursue this. It'll be worth it. So it's ties in all these elements. But it seems, we're always warned about comfort, and the easy life leads to probably a crappy, unsuccessful life. But we could go on and on about all of that. But getting back to your paper, because a lot of this really ties into several Japanese words. And another one was 3 possible needs that work provides. So what are they?
Yeah, so this is the work of a guy named David Bluestein, who's a wonderful scholar who kind of came up with the idea of the psychology of working. And really the psychology of working is predicated, he says, on these 3 needs. One is survival, which is financial security. A second is relatedness, which he would describe as basically coworker support. And a third is self-determination, which you could think of as autonomy or control at work, or just the ability to choose your own adventure in different kinds of ways. And so these three needs are also present in a whole bunch of other literature in the psychology literature. In fact, there's this whole entire theory called self-determination theory, which is very similar. I think that this is also very similar to other humanist perspective like Maslow, where there's kind of very survival oriented needs at the base. In fact, often some people when they think about Maslow think about a hierarchy of needs in the triangle. There's this wonderful book by a guy named Scott Barry Kaufman called Transcend, which is a kind of a reimagining of Maslow's work, where he says probably Maslow would have never actually wanted the triangle nor proposed it, that a better metaphor is to think about those needs a little bit more like a sailboat, where the actual base of the boat is sitting in the water, and those are your survival needs. Those are the fundamental kind of, safety, security, kind of food on the table, clothes on my back, a safe place to be kind of needs. And if you don't have those things, you're gonna sink. You're not gonna, you can't just be on the water. You need those things, but just having those things aren't going to take you anywhere. If you actually want to sail somewhere, you need a mast, and that mast may be people, and you need a sail, and that sail is going to be all the self-determination oriented, meaning oriented, kind of self-actualization, transcendent oriented things that will actually take you somewhere. But again, those things are useless if you have no boat to actually sit in.
Yeah, these three needs actually relate to another Japanese word called ibasho, and it's a compound of the verb iru, to exist, and basho, place. And it used to just mean whereabouts, but it's now a psychological term that sort of came about because of Japan's social withdrawal problems and truancy problems. And it basically means your place to be. And it has three elements. And one is safety or security, so very much related to survival. Your connection with others, where you feel accepted, you feel you belong. And the other element is where you feel you feel empowered and you can self-actualize. So, yeah, all these terms about what we need are very much related, sort of regardless of the origin. But the Japanese language has a cool way for describing them. So ibasho is another fascinating word. Let's move on to what you mentioned before, this idea of the dark side of meaningful work. And when I read that, I thought, that's odd. Like, how could there be a dark side to meaningful work? And then I discovered, okay, I get it now. Yeah, there definitely can be a dark side to meaningful work. So research has shown that in certain contexts, a high degree of meaning or passion is related to the exploitation of workers and the erosion of mental health and well-being, which seems like a ridiculous contradiction, doesn't it? So would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. And I'm actually going to start with the opposite, which is the vast majority of the research. Like if you ask most people who work in this general field about meaningful work, and indeed, if you ask most organizational consulting firms that have purpose arms and help people find meaning at work, they will say to you, and there's lots of good evidence that says meaningful work is actually very good for us. Like it's definitely, it will make you a better corporate citizen. You'll be more pro-social. You'll probably be more committed to the organization you're a part of. You'll generally be more motivated to be able to do the things that you're doing. All of that generally tends to lead to more innovation, more creativity. All of that generally leads to a lot of like good emotions and like happiness, you would think. Or at least if all of those things are going well, you would think that there's like this spillover effect where well-being good would get increased, which is true, I think, for a lot of people and not true for everyone. And so I'm going to actually give you an example of the zookeeper. Yeah. And zookeepers are like the thorn in the side of this particular argument that meaningful work is always a good thing. And so this is actually the article that started off this whole entire research paper, to an article that was published in 2009 by couple guys named Bunderson and Thompson, and they looked at zookeepers throughout North America. And zookeepers tend to see their work as a calling. The work that they do is deeply meaningful. If you're going into to be a zookeeper, it's generally because this is something that you just feel called to be doing. And generally, there's a high moral stake to the work. The animals that are under your care literally live or die based on your efforts. Often the animals that are in zoos are sometimes the last of their species. And so, if you don't do a good job, you might be responsible for the extinction of a whole entire species. So the work is important. And not surprisingly, zookeepers put in a lot of work. They will work nights and weekends. If they're needed, they'll show up. Many zookeepers say, I would do this job even if I wasn't paid for it. And surprise, surprise, according to Bunderson and Thompson's research, zookeepers are notoriously underpaid, like crazily underpaid and overworked, and quite frankly, exploited. And many of them will actually say, the people who own these zoos know that we will do this work and come in this work because it is so important. And they totally take advantage of that. And zookeepers burn out and zookeepers leave and are kind of devastated by that. And this example is just the perfect illustration of what the dark side of meaningful work actually is. When the work that you do has a true high moral stake, what it can lead to is this, what Bob Vallerin would call obsessive passion. Like you care so much that you can't actually separate yourself. And that leads to this boundary inhibition, where literally the boundaries between work and life become irrelevant. That also means that that all the people at home who might actually provide you social support, you're not spending time with them. They don't necessarily understand why you're working so hard. You also kind of you have this perspective when you're engaged in deeply meaningful work that that the work is its own reward, that there's these intrinsic motivation rewards, and so you accept less pay. You actually will go into job interviews expecting, well, I shouldn't get paid as much as this other job because I'm doing it because it's good work. And not surprisingly, that leads to some exploitation within organizational contexts. And that generally tends to lead to negative emotions like career regret, like, why am I in this profession to begin with? All of that tends to lead to lower life satisfaction. All of that just increases a huge amount of stress that work can give to us, which infiltrates everything. And then that ultimately just leads to burnout.
It's sad and tragic to hear that people would be taken advantage of in that example. Like you're caring for animals, and I think there are some people who just love animals so much sounds like they do anything to look after them. I think it also happens at animal shelters a lot too.
And of course, those aren't it's kind of a wonderful example because everyone's like, oh, the zookeepers. But we're also talking about nurses, educators, anyone who works in a nonprofit, international aid. Like, this is true of many people who are actually doing good work in the world. And in some ways, the more meaningful the profession, the more at risk somebody is for some of these dark sides of meaning.
Yeah, I can actually now recall when I lived in Japan, I used to teach English in Japan, and one of my students was a teacher, and she worked at a deaf school, and so she was doing a lot of obviously sign language. And I remember we're having a one-on-one lesson, and she just broke down in tears, and she was just overwhelmed with the stress of her job and working 6 days a week, and really enjoyed her job, but I think had reached, burnout, and felt she couldn't do anything about it, and that she just had to push on. And I was like, well, you can't push on. You've got to address this. So just, quit if it's that stressful. So, yeah, it must be very hard to be trapped in this situation where you love the work. The work is meaningful, yet you're sacrificing maybe relationships outside of work, your health, and it's kind of no ideal solution forward. You either keep going or quit. Is that what usually happens? I imagine if these zookeeper owners are thinking, great, we can get all these people to work, for minimum wage, we'll just wait till one quits and we'll find someone else.
I think that so first of all, I think that it's important not to paint everyone with the same brush here. Most zookeepers, I'm sure, most zoo management firms are not out to exploit their workers necessarily. Some of this stuff actually happens more nefariously. Like it's not intentional necessarily. It's kind of like the product of these societal conditions that we find ourselves in. In fact, very few people are, if you ask them, will say, yeah, my desire is to exploit people. And yet social scientists, I think, have been looking at meaningful work with skepticism, certainly critical scholars for decades, kind of asking, questions. There's these kind of like wonderful words like, the management of the soul, or governing the soul, or the symbolic manipulation of meaning, and kind of ways in which the colonization of the soul is another one. I think that work in all sorts of different contexts, we can find different ways of manipulating different aspects. And I think especially in these days, where a lot of organizations are trying to compete for talent and trying to, and don't necessarily have more money to be able to pay them. I think a lot of organizations are trying to say, hey, can we compete on meaning? Can we try to drive more motivation, more performance, more commitment to our organization by trying to get people to find more meaning in the work that they do? And of course, again, like I think we want work that is meaningful. It's a good thing, but what folks like David Bluestein and the United Nations would say is that we have to, like, before, as an antecedent to meaningful work, you should really have decent work. Like you should have a living wage first. And if you don't have a living wage, then maybe that's a place where we have to just pause for a second and say, am I trying to invoke something like meaning out of people without appropriately, creating the conditions where they can be successful first?
Yeah, that's an important point. And you do define decent work. So do you want to just touch on that definition?
Sure. I mean, it's, I think I said it a little bit earlier. It's decent work is kind of freedom, equity, security, and dignity. At least that's the UN's kind of 4-part definition of what decent work actually means and what it looks like. Yeah. I mean, I think that in an organization, in a societal context, trying to figure out how do we create the conditions of what decent work is potentially really challenging, especially, at least in the US, as an example. I was just speaking with Zainab Tan, who runs the Good Jobs Institute, and she works at MIT Sloan, and she studies, what are good jobs and what are lousy jobs, or what David Graeber might call bullshit jobs, that exist. And the reality is that in the US, and these are statistics from the Brookings Institute, is that probably about 40% of the US working population is making less than $20,000 American a year, really? which is not livable. You can't actually, and if you're trying to raise a family, you're trying to, that's just astronomical. And who are those people? Well, they're the people who, the rest of us are served by every single day. They're the people who work in the retail shops and serve our fast food and clean, our environments and care for our elders, or when we're sick ourselves. Those are the people who literally create the underpinnings of the society that we're part of, who in many ways become invisible, and for whom decent work is not a reality. And so talking about meaningful work in that context can sometimes be really challenging to try to figure out, hey, how do we start here? How do we start here?
Wow, you've blown me away. I mean, I'm not sure if you guys have minimum wage. But yeah, we have I guess, a minimum wage requirement, and um, it's much more than $20,000 a year. So that must be
Yeah. I
extremely
mean,
hard.
there's certainly minimum wage, but minimum wage does not necessarily guarantee that you're making enough hours to work, and especially at gig economy and Uber Eats drivers and all the rest. And there's lots of ways in which people fail to necessarily be able to cram together enough minimum wage hours to make the deal. And minimum wage is very different than, for example, in some countries, there's guaranteed, basic income, which is, a very different thing than minimum wage.
Yeah, and with the recent inflation, global inflation we've all experienced, it must be even harder. But let's go back to the dark side of meaningful work, because you argue that this dark side of meaningful work relates to the post-pandemic workforce phenomena known as the Great Resignation and quiet quitting, which we've all heard about, but maybe we don't have a full understanding or clear understanding of these two terms. So, yeah, these were, I guess, reactions to the pandemic, and maybe it woke some people up. So, what's the Great Resignation, and is it still going on?
Yeah. So the Great Resignation was really the talk of 2021, especially in the US and Canada, but I think also broadly around the world. And it was this post-pandemic, post-lockdown reality where employers just couldn't fill jobs that they had easily been able to fill before. Like that was really what the Great Resignation was. And it's like, where did all these people go? And when they say all these people, and you look at the literature of who was most impacted around the Great Resignation, it's most significant among those who were doing in-person, low-wage work, and it was often younger workers for whom were people who were most impacted by this. And there were big macroeconomic moments in time where things were happening over the past couple decades that were similar, like the dot-com bust and boom and the Great Recession of 2008. But this was markedly different. And you ask if it's still going on, and I would say most reports that I see now seem to show that a lot of that has stabilized. This was a bit of, sometimes the Great Resignation has now been deemed the Great Reshuffling of kind of supply and demand. But it was this really interesting moment, especially coupled with the quiet quitting phenomenon, which was what you also said we talked about, which was kind of like the talk of, if the Great Resignation was the talk of 2021, quiet quitting was the talk of 2022. And the definition of quiet quitting was opting out of tasks beyond one's assigned duties and or becoming less psychologically invested in work. Basically, I'm just doing work to rule. I'm only doing what I absolutely need to do and nothing else, or maybe even a little less. And that's not a new thing. Like, that kind of job action, like that's,
Why
tried,
yeah.
tested, and true response to to work that you don't necessarily want to be doing or don't feel like you're kind of getting enough. But the thing that was strange about the 2022 period was you had organizations like Gallup, or the Strategic Human Resources Association, who were saying that this was like 50% of the US population's workforce was experiencing things like quiet quitting or participating in things like quiet quitting in 2022, which is just crazy. And so what we tried to say in the article was, what's the relationship between those phenomena and this question of meaningful work and decent work? And really, I think, especially if you look at the people who are participating most in this kind of job action, they were often people where the level of meaning was extremely low in their jobs, and the level of decency was extremely low in their jobs. And again, all these kind of really low wage, in person, crappy bullshit, to use the term that David Graeber uses, jobs, that people were kind of saying, I'm out. If I have a choice, especially if the government is going to give me a wage subsidy that I can take advantage of, I'm going to try to say no. And so then this question became, could we see that job action as what this wonderful article in MIT Sloan, a guy named Dietert, called calibrated contribution, where there's like a whole bunch of societal context going on here. Like, for example, in the US, minimum wage is at its lowest point in 66 years. The CEO to average worker, to not just average worker, but like lowest paid worker, in some cases is as wide as 670 to 1.
Insane.
Like, that's insane.
That is insane.
Right?
It's ridiculous.
The US now reflects levels of income inequality that are typically only seen in undeveloped or really corrupt countries. Unions are at their lowest point of participation since 1955. And at least in the US, there's no significant legislation that would improve worker rights in sight. And so what Dieter's argument is like, if work lacks meaning and decency, can workers still have the powerful to make work meaningful just by doing less of it? Which is a really interesting way of thinking about what we might have seen in that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, you basically relate all that to feelings of interpersonal injustice at work, and that would make sense if you felt this is unjust, like this is not fair. I'd rather probably quit and just take what I can from the government in terms of any employment benefits or unemployment benefits, I should say. Not employment benefits, unemployment benefits, which in Australia is quite generous. So we definitely had the same problem. I think after the pandemic, people, restaurants couldn't get wait staff, and everyone had this great experience of, oh, wow, I can stay at home and have enough to live on. And then thought, why bother getting a job? There's no rush. So especially if those jobs are lousy jobs or bullshit jobs, which are real terms. So, and one is an interesting article, which I have read, on the phenomenon of bullshit jobs, a work rant. And that's quite a famous article. And the idea is it basically, there was this prediction back in the 1930s that eventually we would only be working a 15-hour work week. And that's not the case. And in fact, we're doing the opposite. And many of us are doing these effectively pointless jobs in Europe, North America, Australia, all over the world. And they have sort of no moral or spiritual value. In fact, they have moral and spiritual damage. And it's a scar across our collective soul. So, yeah. What are your thoughts on this term bullshit jobs? And I guess it's a real term now.
I love it because I think it just calls a spade a spade. I think that David Graeber's work was incredible. He passed away, I think, a couple of years ago now.
Okay.
Just before he published his latest book with David Weinstein, which is an extraordinary kind of relook at human civilizations. And kind of all of the myths that we have built around social inequality, and the evolution of our species. It's called the dawn of everything. And yes, it's a mammoth book, but an incredible read. Anyways, I that's not, that doesn't get at bullshit jobs, but yes, like I think that there's just so many of those jobs, and again, I think it speaks to much of what we're trying to articulate in the article, which is that we can't just focus on meaningful work. We have to focus on decent and meaningful work, and if we don't, we're really missing something. Yeah.
Have you ever had a lousy or bullshit job?
That's a good question. I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, I worked in, I certainly worked in contexts where I wasn't paid, higher than minimum wage or less. But it's interesting because, and I guess it speaks a little bit to the work that we can all do, and the fact that not everyone who's in a lousy or bullshit jobs thinks of it as a lousy or bullshit job. And even those jobs that I did participate in, which I guess other people might have thought, could have labeled it that way, I was actually really interested in doing, and kind of found all sorts of meaning and purpose in the work that I did, largely by rethinking and refocusing and kind of restoring that work, and even sometimes by finding other people who were in a shared experience with me and kind of creating a common narrative with them and a sense of belonging in being in a lousy or bullshit job, which changed it from a lousy and bullshit job into something else. All of which, there's lots of research again that says that's possible too, at an individual level, for everything from what's sometimes called dirty work, like people who are janitors or garbage men, or people kind of, in those kinds of work, to pink work, people, sex workers, and others who are doing all sorts of work that we might not necessarily consider, you know in the kind of meaningful work territory, but nonetheless, who find great meaning and passion in the work that they do.
That all makes sense too. This it's sort of it's us against them kind of mentality, and we'll get through this, and we're doing work that matters, even though people look down upon us. You can imagine that camaraderie or the belongingness would form with people
Exactly.
in those jobs. So let's flip it now. Let's go away from the dark side and move on to, I guess, mental health and well-being. And recently in the United States, you noted that the Surgeon General released a framework for mental health and well-being in the workplace. And it's a 5-pillar framework. So do you want to run through that framework?
Sure. So this just came out probably about a year ago. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States, the Surgeon General basically being the top doctor of the United States, came up with this really wonderful evidence-based framework, that really places, the worker voice and equity at the center of what organizations ultimately should be focusing on. And they really, I mean, this framework does a really good job of getting at both that freedom from and freedom to element. So, it starts with just protection from harm, that work should fundamentally allow us a sense of safety and security, and that is an important, essential element of what work can be. From there, we have community and connection, recognizing that we have these human needs of social support and belonging, and that work is a great place for that to happen. That we need work-life harmony, which is really all about those needs of autonomy and self-determination that we talked about earlier, and flexibility, something that I think many people are especially realizing on this side of the pandemic, especially in hybrid and flexible work contexts. That we need opportunities to grow on the job, which, because we all have this desire and need for mastery and learning, and also a real want for accomplishment and achievement in our lives. And mattering at work. And in this framework, mattering at work is defined as satisfying the needs for dignity and meaning. And so, first and foremost in there, it's, work needs to provide us with a living wage, and we need to be able to make sure that workers have some say in the decisions that they get to make in an organizational context. And then we need to think about, hey, how do we build cultures of gratitude and recognition in our organizations? Or how do we ultimately connect individuals to organizational missions and purposes and values, and see those things as kind of intimately connected? How do we help people ultimately feel valued and valuable within their organization?
That's a good question. The term work-life harmonies a bit different to the more common term work-life balance. And actually, one of my past podcast guests and a good friend of mine, Steve Bouchamp, on episode 46, he writes a lot about this idea of harmony as opposed to balance. So, do you think there is a difference between work life harmony and work life balance?
Absolutely. I mean, no, literally nobody that I know, I don't think feels like there is is seeking equilibrium between work and life. I mean, it's even when you say that, like it almost sounds absurd. I mean, that we somehow need to, it needs to be 50-50, like as a balancing act. And so I love the choice of
Mm,
harmony, because harmony is about how things play together, and does it play in a harmonic or a dissonant way? Is it does it does work and life work together in a way that ultimately creates beautiful music, or cacophonous music? And so I think that trying to figure out, and especially for those who are engaged in deeply meaningful work, the likelihood that they are going to even want, a pure 40-hour work like week where they just step away, or a 4-day work week. I mean, some of the things that I think we are trying to impose on work are not actually necessarily even things that people who are engaged in meaningful work want, because they actually love what they do, and they don't necessarily want to step away from it, as but they still need to find harmony.
yes. Now, I do like that term. So, I'll do another shout out to Steve. So, there you go, Steve. Work life harmony. So, it's a real term now, I guess, used by the Surgeon General. So, that's interesting. So, on this theme, let's move into leadership and organizational conditions for dignified, meaningful, and self fulfilling work. So, if we've got some CEOs or some people who are about to do a startup and they're leaders, what should leaders and companies be doing to create eudaimonic work? And I think there is three ways this can occur.
Yeah, I think that, just to bottom line it and simplify it, um, there's a lot of really good research out there around what good looks like in this space, and it almost always starts with making sure that you're running a company that has good human values at their core. And what do those values look like? Well, they're often about care or connection, mutuality, fairness, integrity, maybe a pursuit of excellence. Those are the kinds of values that in the research literature are often associated with people doing decent work and doing meaningful work. Um, and values are important, but um, values can often just live on a wall or on a website and not actually be materialized. And so the second thing is really about practices and policies. And how do those values move from espoused
Hmm.
things to enacted things? And so if you think about every moment that matters throughout the whole life cycle that an employee might have with an organization, from the time that they're hired to how they're onboarded to how they're rewarded to how they're managed, their performance management, to how they get promoted, to maybe how they're fired, and what happens afterwards. Every single one of those moments is a moment where those values can come to life in very concrete ways. And asking the question, do the policies and practices that we hold as an organization help or hinder an individual's well-being, and help us create decency, dignity, meaning, or take those things away? And then, of course, who manages those policies and procedures and practices? Well, it's often the leaders of the organizations. Ultimately, organizations are structured through individuals who hold power. And so, how do you hold power in an organization? What does leadership look like? And there's a guy named Mike Steger who, is a really pioneering figure in the meaning in life and meaning at work space. And in his review of the literature, he kind of boils it down to 5 major leadership behaviors that you would want to be able to see. One is just about clarity and how you communicate. Two is authenticity, a word that you used earlier, which is really, are you walking your own talk on values? The R is respect. Respect in how you're engaging with others, a kind of fundamental holding of the bar of respectful engagement and communication. M is mattering, and mattering, helping someone feel valued and valuable, making sure that they're recognized. And the last A being autonomy, giving people choice in how decisions are made, giving people, flexibility and freedom to choose their own adventure. Karma with a C is his acronym there.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a nice word choice of word and an acronym. I mean, autonomy seems so important, and we imagine a lot of companies don't allow that, and a lot of managers can be, micromanagers. But to give people this freedom to think for themselves, to make decisions, and this comes back to this idea of leadership, that leaders should be approachable and open to feedback. And how much is that tied into meaningful work now? Is there any research where it says good leadership involves, being willing to accept feedback from your staff and being able to recognize that, okay, I can improve as a leader. I need to grow and improve, work on myself.
Mhm. I think that very much within, I'll answer that in a couple different ways. First of all, Carol Riff would say that that for those of us for us to experience well-being at work, right? For us to experience well-being in life, her dimensions of well-being include first and foremost self-awareness and self-acceptance, of our own strengths and weaknesses, and also a desire to grow and a desire to, quest for mastery in our lives, and just taking those two things, which again, doesn't even include meaning and purpose, which is another major dimension that she focuses on. But just taking those two things, feedback is a gift because it helps us build our awareness of strengths and weaknesses, and it helps us ultimately understand how to grow and become the best versions of ourselves as possible. And if we're doing feedback really well and we're creating the conditions, then we're also activating another dimension of Carol's kind of model, which is positive relationships that are fundamentally built on respectful engagement. And so, that's definitely an answer. And then the other answer that I'd give to that question is, there's wonderful work by Amy Edmondson that basically says psychological safety, or the capacity to speak up and share things like critical feedback to your bosses and not fear retaliation, is probably the number one ingredient to effective teamwork in organizations. And again, if you want meaningful and decent work, psychological safety is probably a fundamental thing that you want to build into your environment.
You'd think so, but it's amazing how many bosses or managers are unapproachable, and staff, fear their boss. It's like, how can a company succeed with that kind of workplace vibe where staff are too afraid to ask for help? So, and I remember experiencing that firsthand. So it was not a good feeling. So that's why I sort of vowed never to work for anyone else about 14 years ago. But let's move on to now the individual. So let's talk directly to our listeners. What individual strategies could they use to find or create more meaningful work?
Well, I hope that those who are listening are blessed with the opportunity to be working in great organizations that have just done everything that I've described, and in societies that value all of the meaningful work that they're doing and have implemented all sorts of regulatory policies and well-being, work. But just in case you're not, yes, there are still very much things that an individual can do to increase their meaning at work. And that often starts with self-awareness and really knowing your signature strengths and the skills that you bring to bear, and your traits, and making sure that you're trying as best as you can with whatever freedom you can have to choose jobs and occupations that allow you to work into those strengths and skills and traits. So that's about choosing, I guess,
Hmm.
the jobs that you have and potentially saying no to jobs if you have that choice and that freedom that don't. But let's say you don't have that job freedom and you still have to do the work, then the next thing would be to try to think about what Amy Resnesky and Jason Berg and Jane Dutton would call job crafting. And job crafting is all about kind of taking the job that you have and turning it into the job that you want by thinking very deliberately about the goals that you set for yourself, the tasks that you have to do on a daily basis, the relationships that you're engaged with, and trying to figure out how do I take all of those things and to the best of my ability, craft them around my strengths and my values and my passions as best as I can. And some people have a great deal of freedom and autonomy to be able to do that. Some people have very little freedom and autonomy to do that. And so that takes us to really the third thing, which is what one researcher calls emplotment. A sociologist in the 80s came up with that term, which I love, which is basically the way that you turn a job into the story that you are telling about yourself, the narrative identity that you hold. Because we can all take the exact same job and think about it in different ways. We can reframe, we can recalibrate, we can refocus,
Mm.
and restory our work in different kinds of ways. And again, I think that there's an ethical imperative here, not to put the responsibility just on the individual, but also not to underestimate the tremendous capacity that we as individuals actually do have to take whatever job we are left with and create meaning, even if that meaning is either doing less of it or just totally restoring what the job is.
Yeah, I did look up implotment, and then it's actually related to some work on Ikigai, that your memories and past experiences and past roles can become a source of Ikigai. And maybe after time, you have this opportunity to reflect and redefine and make meaning of both, good and even negative experiences that may have resulted you in finding uh, a better way to live your life, or it led you to where you are today in some positive way. So yeah, and also making, I guess, the second characteristic is sort of just trying to make the most of your current situation by crafting. So hopefully most of the people listening to this podcast, we're all educated, we all have opportunity. So we're all very lucky. We have the technology to listen to, to record and listen to this episode. So yeah, we can make decisions that benefit us hopefully, despite our circumstances sometimes. But it's also quite painful having a soul destroying job and going to that every day, as I mentioned to you before we started recording. And I did walk out of a job once. I just reached a point where that's it. I'd been documenting workplace abuse, and I think had I gone in the next day, I would have lost it. So I would have broken down. So I think there's also a point where your mental health, your physical health takes priority, and you just it's okay to walk out. You'll survive. And so, as you know, Andrew, this podcast is about the Ikigai concept, but there's also another word, or gai is a suffix that can be added to other verbs. So the verb for for work is hataraku. Hataraki gai is another concept related to obviously meaningful work. And I think it was quite a common term in Japan in the 70s and 80s when their economy was booming. And basically, it's this balance of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. So obviously, meaningful work, good relations at work, but also, probably good pay, good opportunity, and good maybe this belief in a positive future with the work that you do. So I usually ask, what is your ikigai? But do you find hataraki gai So do you have a good balance of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators in the work that you do?
I do. I feel like I'm again, I'll use the term lucky, but I guess it's one of those situations where I do believe that we make our own luck to a certain extent. But in the context of the work that I get to do now, it is extremely extrinsically rewarding. Intrinsically, sorry, extremely intrinsically rewarding. And to a certain extent, I feel like in the world right now, and this is changing, there's an increased interest in these
Yeah,
topics. And over the course of my career over the last couple of decades, it has definitely shifted in terms of people being much more interested and willing to talk about well-being and meaningful work and the conditions that enable success. I mean, all of these things that we're talking about right now, I don't think people would have paid much attention to, not even just before the pandemic. I mean,
yeah,
I think that one of the things that the pandemic has given us to a certain extent is at least a curiosity and an understanding that meaning and well-being and decency are all things that are actually really important in our lives, and that work should be and can be an opportunity and a source for them in a different way than I think I would have necessarily believed that the world would have been as open to even just 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that the other thing that has really happened over the last few years as well is in some ways questions of social justice, questions of equity, questions of fairness have also risen to the surface. And I think a wonderful outcome of all of the work that so many of us have practiced around justice and equity, diversity and inclusion are an understanding that those questions and questions of well-being are kind of two sides of the same coin. That as a guy named Isaac Prolintensky, a community psychologist who I'm a huge fan of, would say, there's no wellness without fairness. And I think that so much of what we've talked about today is a reflection of the fact that there's no wellness without fairness. You can't talk about meaningful work without talking about decent work. And I guess I feel pretty lucky to be able to do both on a daily basis.
Well, it actually sounds like your work is also your Ikigai. So that's a good thing. But outside of work, what is something that would be an Ikigai source for you that is, meaningful and fulfilling?
Mm. Um, the arts is my short answer to that question. I am somebody who literally grew up breathing the arts and valuing the capacity that the arts has for creating transcendent moments in our lives. And so definitely my Ikigai, beyond just the work that I get to practice on a daily basis, is also trying to find these moments of beauty and excellence and transcendence in the world. And I think that the arts is absolutely a beautiful pathway to that.
So do I. I can see just behind you the word flow. So that's very relatable to all that. And I love the arts, as you can see, with my scrolls. The beauty and simplicity in Japanese calligraphy just is astonishing. So yeah, arts, all kinds of arts, whether it's paintings or music or what have you. So thank you so much for writing the paper. It was a lot of work, and you're very knowledgeable, and you're very careful and respectful to acknowledge all these names and people you've mentioned, and starting with Carol Riff. So, how can people reach out to you and learn more about your work?
Absolutely. Well, I would love to talk to anybody who is interested in these ideas, whether it's at an individual level or you're interested in trying to design positive cultures into your organization, or you're interested in public policy around any of these things. I would love to talk with you. The best way to reach me is if you can figure out how to spell it, you can go to eudaimonicbydesign.com. The easier version of that website is eubd.ca. You can also find me on LinkedIn and reach out to me there.
Awesome. We'll put all those links in the show notes. But Andrew, thank you for your time and the work that you do. And yeah, I look forward to one day continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Nick.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ikigai Podcast. To learn more about Ikigai or to become a certified Ikigai Tribe coach, visit ikigaitribe.com.